Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here. I am Jennifer Beck with the Nashville Technology Council, and I just want to welcome you to this episode of our monthly webinar series. It's 3 Signs of a Miserable Job, Preventing Job Dissatisfaction. So I have got a great speaker lined up for you today. It's Bill Wright with HCA, and he has done one of our others in this series as well. And I encourage you to go look at that one if you have not seen it yet. Anyway, I will not delay any further. Bill, I'll hand it over to you and let you get started.
Well, thanks, Jennifer. Um, I'm excited to talk to you a little bit about one of my favorite books, honestly. I've been teaching this curriculum now at HCA for the most part for the last about 7 years. And it's always had a very positive response. So I hope you'll find this useful. I think whether you're a leader, um, who just needs to ask some really important questions about yourself as a leader, because I think the greatest attribute of any good leader is they look really deep inside themselves first and come to an understanding of who they are so that their true identity, their most authentic and genuine version of themselves can be shared with their team members or somebody just entering the workforce. And if you're entering the workforce, these would be things that I would encourage you to kind of evaluate or assess as it relates to the job, especially early on in the job that you take. Or if you've been on the job for a while and you might find some of these signs, and it might be an opportunity for you to pause and really decide on whether you are indeed experiencing job misery, which is what the essence of this book is about. This book was written by Patrick Lencioni. I'm a big fan of Patrick Lencioni. I read everything he writes because of three things. He always writes in fables. I love story. I think story is vitally important for each of us. It establishes community and it allows us to find intersections with each other in our stories. Uh, he writes short fables. That's another criteria for a good book for me. It's got to be short. Big font would be better than small font, and pictures. I like pictures too. So you can tell how cerebral I am at this point. I like a short, to the point, relatable story. And that's exactly how he wraps up many of his books and how he presents them ultimately out. Uh, as Jennifer mentioned, my name is Bill Wright, and I've been with HCA now for about 20 years. 20 years I'm going on right now. It seems like it was yesterday, honestly. I am responsible for the Learning Center of Excellence. That's an organization that focuses on workflow and productivity learning. And don't think of learning as training anymore. This is a pretty high tech group that's focused on using AI, machine learning, predictive analytics, and other technologies to be able to provide meaningful learning experiences to our clinicians at their moment of need in a very personalized and engaging way. And Jennifer mentioned one of those ways. The way the modern learner learns is kind of a YouTube experience, very short micro learning bursts that really address their needs. So it's been a real interesting journey and a lot of fun to kind of explore some of these new technologies in that space. Prior to that, I was with General Motors for about 21 years. So I've had a split career. I didn't realize that. But I was with the automotive industry. When you're born and raised in Detroit, you really get three career choices: Ford, GM, or Chrysler, at least when I was growing up. And I ended up with General Motors and had a great career with General Motors. But a little bit about my story, and then we'll get started, I promise. If I can keep you engaged through this, it will be important because I will refer back to it. I don't believe you should tell a story for story's sake, because a story for story's sake, after all, is simply a story. But a story with context provides relevance. Keep that in mind. Painting a context for people and offering your story in whatever way you offer it in that context creates some sense of relevance for them to be able to consume it in. So I think that's really important. And I'm going to give you some of that context right now. And as I said, as we go through this material, I will refer back to it. Being born and raised in Detroit, I am one of three. My brother and I are extremely close, couple 3 years apart. He still lives in Detroit. In fact, my entire family lives in metropolitan Detroit. My sister was about 11 years behind me. I barely knew her. I married my high school sweetheart. We met at 15 years old. We got married at 20, and she was only, well, put the math together, 4 and 9 respectively. So that's not, I didn't have much of a relationship with her. Still don't, because we live so far away. In my household, which was unfortunately an abusive household, I didn't know you could say that, but I'll say it out loud. We had a fairly chaotic household. My father was an alcoholic, and my desire to earn his love, which I could never do, by the way, I blamed on me. And that's a very noble thing to do. We have to make decisions about who's at fault for things, and most often we'll blame ourselves, surprisingly. And there's two reasons. At the core of who we are, we like to perceive that we have control. So if we're to blame, then we can control it through altered behaviors, alternate paths, you name it. The second thing is it's very noble to take that burden on, and it feels like something you can work on. And at the very core of most of what we like to work. We're productive. We like to be productive. We like to change things. We like to modify. So I took that on, and I subscribed to the idea. Neuroscience would say I took a path of least resistance. I created a neural path to avoid the trauma that was occurring in my life by creating this alternate path that said that if I could just perform and produce at a higher level, certainly my father would love me the way I desired to be loved and be a part of my life the way that I would prefer that he be a part of my life, which was a very healthy and involved way. Well, that didn't happen, despite the fact that I did excel in academics and I did excel in sports. That's surprising looking at me. That was a long time ago. And I had some great teams around me, by the way. And I was very fortunate and blessed to be a part of some really great teams and do some really great things at the state level, both in track and in football. But, I would have sacrificed all those news clippings that my mom still pulls out when I go to her house and have to look at for the 15th time, maybe the 1500th time, actually, but that's important to her. I would have sacrificed all that if he would have just showed up at one of those games, at one of those academic achievement events. But he didn't. And so I just kept trying harder and harder. And then my faith comes into this, and I'm not going to get lengthy here at all. But you do need to know it's there, because what happened is I kind of got involved with a church that was actually adjacent to our home. And what I saw there was this like group of people that came together and really loved on each other well. And I knew that was kind of the missing piece. That's what I desired. And I wanted to know more. So I went to a school that they offered during the summer with my brother, and people just loved on us unconditionally. They saw two boys that were alone and didn't have mom and dad present. Mom too busy managing chaos at home. Dad barely a parent. When he was, it was a lot to manage, as I just mentioned. And so they took care of us. They really nurtured us. They really saw an opportunity. And I'd never been loved like that before, to be honest with you. And it was very appealing. So we started to go to that church, and there was a couple that actually took ownership of being our surrogate parents. And I'll be forever grateful. They're both deceased now, but I'll be forever grateful for changing the trajectory of our lives by just offering to be available and to love on us well. Well, the problem with this faith component of my journey is I didn't know I was getting involved in a faith that was very legalistic. And I'm not trying to label. I don't like labels. I think they're dangerous. I think they're inappropriate. But what I've come to know legalism as is very rule-based. Like, you have to do things a certain way or there will be great disappointment, and you better perform and produce at a very high level now, because the stakes just got higher. And so for somebody that already subscribed to this idea that I have to perform or produce at a very high level just to win my father's favor, now I'm in this position where the stakes are extremely high, and I'm feeling tremendous guilt and shame because I cannot perform or produce at that level. It's only entrenching in me a more toxic component, and that was not good. But along came General Motors, and I remember when I got my internship, I was so fortunate. I thought I was going to drive a Corvette the rest of my life. I've never driven one now. I've now realized just working for General Motors doesn't mean you're going to drive a Corvette. But I was so excited to work for them, and they were my addiction. And I traded my father's addiction, which was alcohol primarily, for work. And what I did is I found a culture that said, if you do perform and produce, no kidding, at a very high level, we don't care how many you leave behind in your wake. We just want results. And that was intoxicating to me, because finally somebody was paying attention to my work effort. And I finally was receiving what I thought I needed as an individual. Fast forward a little bit, I'm going to introduce a player or two, and then I promise I'll be done. But I think this is important to go back to because you're going to hear this in the curriculum as well. A guy named Ed Northern comes into my life. Ed Northern is a guy that I learned the value of active listening from. I only know that now. You know, we learn in college or school the power of reflective listening. Reflective listening simply ensures a common understanding. It says, Brian, if I heard you correctly, you said, and Brian acknowledges that's exactly what he said. And then we have common understanding. That's reflective listening. Active listening is where you somebody totally invests in the conversation to the point that they're not just going to ensure common understanding, they're going to invite themselves into that conversation and share in the journey accordingly. Well, Ed was one of those, the most unlikely of all suspects. Ed was a 42-year veteran at General Motors. He had responsibility for North American operations. At that time, I had responsibility for Asia Pacific, Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So I'd risen to a pretty high level, and they were right. If you worked really hard, 80 and 90 hours a week minimum, and you outproduced and outperformed, they had a whole bunch of carrots, not just one or two carrots, a whole bunch of them that they were willing to feed you along the way. And I took every bite of every bunch, trust me, only to try to satisfy my own desire to prove myself and to win some favor along the way. The problem was, if you remember that high school sweetheart and this individual I married when I was 20, and we now have 3 children with, and at 38 years old, we're growing into their teen years, my oldest being fairly well into her teen years. I realized very quickly that I needed to continue to provide for them until this one day occurred. And we were sitting on 10 acres in Michigan on a lake. We had bought the 10 acres. We were ready to build what we called a dream house. And the world had lied to me about a lot of things. One of them was what defines success. And I'm not going to go deep into that, but I bought it. And this was one of those criteria that you build a big home on the lake on 10 acres. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with that, except when you use it to measure whether you're successful or valuable or not. And so I did that, and we were standing there. And my wife is very precise and very, very perceptive, has a great deal of discernment, and was just talking about how to face the house. You know, we don't want too much sun on the front porch. We don't want those northeast winds to come up and cause drifts and all these factors. It was really important to her, but she obviously didn't know how busy I was. I say that tongue in cheek because I was so full of myself. I actually believe that. And had she known how busy I was, she wouldn't have bothered me with these minor details for so long, but she did. And she went on and on. And eventually we got to the point that I said, Donna, I've got to move on. We've been talking about this for a long time, and I need to get back to work. And she said, that's okay. I'll go ahead and make the decision since you don't live here anymore. And that was the day that literally changed the trajectory of my life and my career. 6 months later, I tried what every good person does that gets in this place of wanting to preserve what they believe success looks like, but also make sure that they're taking care of those that they love around them. That stayed with me for a long time because it literally made the hair on my arms stand up. And I thought about it almost every day. It kind of cooled the temperature in our house, if you know what I mean. Things weren't as warm and enjoyable as they used to be, but they got a little cold. And I could tell there was some real tension between us. So I did what any good person like that would do, and that is manipulation. I turned to manipulation. Good lesson here for leaders. There's a very fine line between influence and manipulation. Make sure you always check yourself. The fine line consists of something like this. When we influence well, we bring others along the journey. We allow them to participate in it, much like active listening, by the way. When we manipulate, we know where we're going, no one else does, and no one's invited to participate. Check that. As you get into leadership or whatever you do as an individual performer, make sure you hold yourself true to influence as opposed to manipulation. Well, I went to manipulation. I basically said, hey, I got a call from a recruiter on my little BlackBerry. These were these little devices that had all these little numbers on them, and it was really cool to have one. If you had one, you were pretty important. And so I wore it on my holster as a badge of honor. It was fantastic. I got this call from a recruiter in New Jersey. And I figured if I told her that I took it serious because I heard her, that she would be just fine. But when I told her that it was for a job in Nashville and quickly excused it away because we had never been to Nashville, of course, And I told her that it was with healthcare, and I didn't know the first thing about healthcare because, after all, I was born with 10W40 in my veins. And when I told her that it was with a company called HCA, which was probably some mom and pop company that I didn't desire to work for because I like working for big companies, big corporations, she challenged me. And she said, you always said you wanted to do more than make shock absorbers and fuel and energy and engine management systems. You wanted to do something more meaningful. Healthcare sounds like a good option. We love Nashville. And I said, Donna, we've never been to Nashville. She said, we go there every time we go to Florida. What we found out is that's actually Knoxville, and there's a big difference. But she was right. The hills we talked about and what a beautiful country it was, and maybe one day we'd even retire there. Not knowing geography, I bought that one as well. And then she told me to go out to the World Wide Web. If you remember, you may not, but I do. Well, you had to type in www.hcahealthcare.com. And what I found is a $28 billion company at that time that is now $68 billion. So this was no small company. This was a large corporation. And with that, she endorsed me, encouraged me really to go and do the interview. And I did. And they offered me the job on the first interview. And when they did that, I had a choice to make. I could go and lie and say they didn't offer the job, I didn't get it, or I could tell her the truth. And I can't tell you how thankful I am that I chose truth. All right, fast forward very quickly to the end of the story. We took the job. My daughter was a senior going into high school. Everybody said, you can't do that. Why are you leaving GM with a great salary, a new car every month and a half, a nice little office, a parking garage, all the perks you could ever want? Your son, your second child, a son, is going into middle school, and your youngest is just getting into the third grade. This is the exact wrong time to be doing this, Bill. And despite what they said, it couldn't have been a better thing that we did. My wife, with her level of discernment and her wisdom, quite frankly, said, let's do it. We need a reboot. And we did. And so I've been here for 20 years. They all have spouses, wonderful spouses. I have 7 grandchildren as a result of all of that. And I'm thankful for that. And life really couldn't be better because HCA is truly a great company to work for. And so for me, that fits very, very well for me. And it's been a real blessing. Let me tell you about a call I got to end this story. I was in building 4 at the beginning of my career with HCA. That's up on the hill, if you know the HCA healthcare corporate headquarters. I was sitting in my office and I got a call, and it sounded like this. Bill, Ed Northern here. And I thought, well, that, of course, that's Ed Northern. Nobody really talks like that, but Ed does. And I said, Ed, how did you get my phone number and why are you calling? And he said, well, I hope you don't mind, but Heidi gave it to me. And I said, Heidi? Heidi who? And he said, Heidi the recruiter. And I realized at that moment when I said, Ed, how do you know Heidi? He said, have a great life. You deserve it. And I realized at that point, somebody really did actively listen to the point of getting involved, not to change my mind, but to create an opportunity for me. And I'll be forever grateful to those folks at that church, that little church that changed the trajectory of my life, my brother's life, and our careers. I'll be forever grateful for Ed Northern, a very unsuspecting individual that decided to actively listen to me on almost a daily basis about this conflict that he could hear, that I couldn't hear myself, and making an opportunity available to me at the end of the day. By the way, at the very end of the story, I did reconcile with my father as well. So let's talk about preventing job dissatisfaction. That's my story. That's the context. I'll refer back to it as we go through this. This is a fascinating book. You know, it really focuses on, as a matter of fact, it used to be called by another name. Does anybody know the previous name of this book? I'll be curious to know if anybody knows this. You can just put it in chat if you do.
And I'll also jump in and just say, I forgot to mention that we encourage participation and interaction. So if at any time you have questions or comments, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask questions as well as the chat window.
No, it's perfect. Perfect. Yeah, I love interaction. So I always tell my students at Lipscomb or at Belmont or wherever I'm teaching, you know, this is not rhetorical. Let's interact because we can gain so much from each other. I know it's a little harder in a virtual environment, but please, employee engagement. Okay, that's interesting. Yes, you got it. Here it is. So let me introduce you to it. This was literally the naming of the original book, The Three Signs of a Miserable Job. Okay. But what happened is he reintroduced the book and called it something different. Isn't that brilliant? Because he sold millions with the, no, that's not true, but he did. And so millions with the old title and millions with the new title. All you got to do is change the title. But what really happened was with the previous title, The Three Signs of a Miserable Job, most people left that book thinking only about misery. And they weren't thinking about how to spot the signs to improve the situation or at least address it proactively. They just thought about how miserable they were. He had another book, you might recognize it, The Five Dysfunctions of a Team. Same thing, very negative. Most people were leaving their encounter with the five dysfunctions of the team, calling out the dysfunction and hyper focused on and hypersensitive to the dysfunction in their own teams. Isn't that interesting? And with both books, he renamed them because he that was not the intended result. So he really didn't change much in terms of the content. He did reposition some of the content to be more positive, to be more focused on how to improve situations, how to recognize these things and improve them. But he called this one Truth About Employee Engagement. The other one, by the way, is The Five Behaviors of a Cohesive Team. Interesting. So in this particular book, Lencioni says, I'm gonna really emphasize to folks how they can understand and recognize the signs of a miserable job, and then also, and most importantly, help them understand some practical ways to address contributors to the miserable experience that they're having. Now, I thought we'd start with this great philosopher, Johnny Carson. Some of you may not even recognize that name. I certainly do. He was the king, really, of late night TV. He had the original late night TV. And then David Letterman came along, and then, Jimmy Fallon's come along, and there's lots of others now. But Johnny Carson hosted a kind of an interview type show late at night, and I would watch it all the time. He's really not a great philosopher. I say that tongue in cheek, but I love what he had to say here. He said, never continue in a job you don't enjoy, highlight enjoy. If you're happy, highlight happy, and what you're doing, you'll have inner peace, highlight inner peace. And if you have that, you will have had more success, highlight success, than you could have possibly imagined. Now, I don't know about you, but how does that sound to you? Just give me the first word that comes to mind when you think of that. When you really consider it, don't dwell on it too long. Just hit that chat with the first thing that comes to mind when you read that phrase, that philosophy, that thought process. Don't be shy. Anything? I can tell you for me what it presents is a very soft statement. Oh, seek job satisfaction. I like that. That's right. That's essentially what it's saying. Seek job satisfaction. So I thought, remember my story, what job satisfaction looked like is you reach a certain level of compensation with certain perks and certain responsibilities, especially in a very protocol centric type of organization like GM was, right? Find your calling and passion. What a great statement that is. What I found out is exactly what this says. This is all about passion. This is about your inner self. Because let's face it, what you enjoy, Shalini, I think that's how you pronounce the name. I hope it is. Shalini, what you enjoy and what I enjoy, that's left up to us. Those are very individualized perspectives. What you're happy with and what I'm happy with is up to you. What you have inner peace ultimately as a result of enjoyment and happiness is up to you. And success gets defined by whom? You. Don't let the world define that for you. Find your calling and your passion and live that out. And in that, you will find this inner peace. So to me, what seemed like a very soft, that would have been the first thing that came to mind for me, a soft statement, kind of, wow, that sounds great, is very profound. And I think Johnny Carson honestly captured it precisely. In fact, you might recognize this guy. Abraham Maslow. Well, that's not a real picture, as you can tell, but Abraham Maslow was an interesting guy. Who knows about Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Are you familiar with that? Just give me a quick thumbs up if you are. I want to kind of test this out real quick. Because actually, what Johnny Carson didn't realize he was doing is he was actually restating Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That's kind of interesting. All right, so tell me how many of you know about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Anybody familiar with it? That'll determine the level. Okay, good. You are, Brian? Anyone else? Great. Shalini, you are? Anyone else? Okay, so we've got a couple folks that are. So let me spend just a little bit of time with it. Basically, what Abraham Maslow said is, okay, I want to hear this one. Marcus says, the previous slide reminds me of the idea of ikigai, a Japanese concept that roughly translates to reason for being. Oh, I love this. It's the intersection of what you love, what you're good at, what the world needs, and what you can be paid for. Marcus, well said. Well said. Thank you. I may incorporate that. Can I copy and paste? I probably can. But we're going to actually talk about that with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because that's precisely what it says as well. What it says is there was a belief. This pyramid is predicated, it was developed by Abraham Maslow in a way that says you have to achieve each one of these layers in the pyramid as you work your way up the pyramid to ultimately self-actualize. And so what is self-actualization? Can anybody give me a really quick definition? And if not, I'll go ahead and define it for you. Marcus just about hit it. I'll tell you what, I'll launch off Marcus's since it was so close. Self-actualization is becoming everything that you are capable of becoming and aspirational about becoming. Both of those together is very important. There are many people that are not very capable, but highly aspirational. That's not self-actualization. That's actually a bit of deception. And then there are those people that are highly aspirational, but not very capable. Both of those have to work together to come together for you to self-actualize in the context of something like what Marcus mentions, something you can be paid for, something you can do in your work of art, something you can live out in a calling that you have. Whatever the case may be, whatever the context is, this is about you becoming everything you possibly desire to be and are capable of becoming. Okay, so that's the pinnacle of this pyramid. Well, the way you work up the pyramid is basically he believed that you have to provide people with certain needs. Their needs need to be taken care of at different levels to move to the next level. First of all, physiological. That's kind of like breathing, food, water, sleep, the very basic needs, very, very, very basic needs. Then safety comes along. And once those safety needs are met, then love and belonging can take place. Ultimately, once you have loved well in community, which is an important one, okay, the ability to exist in community, which I talked to you about, happens often through our stories and being vulnerable and sharing our stories and finding those intersections. You know what's interesting when I share a story? One of three things happens every time. I relate directly to your story. Your story doesn't resonate with me one bit, but at least I understand who you are better. Or most people, there are certain points of your story that definitely resemble my story as well. And those create opportunities to commune with each other, to be together, to talk about things in common, and also provide us an opportunity not to feel alone in our stories. So I think that's pretty awesome. So love and belonging is super important. And once you can do that in community, then you can gain esteem. And what esteem is confidence. If I can exist in community in a healthy way, then I can exist on my own in a healthy way. Most people believe you have to believe in yourself. You have to feel comfortable with yourself before you can exist in community well. He said just the opposite, and I subscribe to that. When you belong in community and you offer your genuine, authentic version of yourself, you gain confidence that you can effectively engage in a community that way so that you can carry that forward as an individual. And that gives you tremendous self-esteem. Finally, once you have that esteem, that confidence, you can begin to self-actualize. Communities shape some of those capabilities and aspirations for you. The confidence level, the achievement, the respect that you get as you gain your esteem only helps to further stamp what self-actualization looks like. So that's kind of interesting. 1943, that happened. Okay. What do you think the hardest level of the pyramid is to achieve? You can just pick one. The hardest. And most companies used to, and I'll say prior to the 2000s, used to really stop at, quite frankly. and feel that they were satisfying their employees and they should just feel good about themselves because of it. Top one. That is a hard one for sure. Yes. But it's not the hardest. The hardest is actually love and belonging. This communal aspect, this idea of having to exist in community in a healthy way is by far the hardest and the one that most companies stop at. Let me see if this sounds familiar to you. In my GM experience, as I mentioned, this was a very bureaucratic, very protocol centric, very positional authority type of organization, highly predicated on how you perform and produce. So what they felt is that as long as they gave you a good place to work, a good pay, and you had good safety, this would have been OSHA time, there was good safety. We made sure you had a safe environment to work in as well. You should be satisfied. You should feel good about yourself. You should self-actualize around that. And what Maslow says is that stops short of what real self-actualization looks like. Well, this guy named Frederick Herzberg comes along, and he comes up with this motivational hygiene theory. And he basically says, no. Yes, Maslow, I love your pyramid, and I agree with it. However, you missed some key points. There are two other elements you need to consider. Okay? And that is satisfaction and motivation. Those are two of the most important things we want to achieve out of the model as people self-actualize. Interesting. So in this model, what he said is if you just meet these hygiene factors, these basic requirements, company policies, rate of pay, working conditions, things I just mentioned, people will be highly dissatisfied and highly demotivated. It's not enough. Okay? But if you meet them personally, their intrinsic needs, not just the extrinsic motivational needs, but the intrinsic ones, the ones that matter to them. Remember Johnny Carson? The ones they enjoy and make them happy. Then you move to a very positive satisfaction and a very positive motivation. And ideally, they can self-actualize as a result. I think it's interesting why these ones on the right, these motivational factors, are highly personal. Let's take one of them. Who decides on what achievement looks like? Who decides on what achievement really looks like? The individual does. I get to decide what achievement looks like for me. Marcus gets to decide what it looks like for him. Shalini gets to decide what it looks like. Brian gets to decide what it looks like. It's up to the individual. And it's the same with career advancement and personal growth and job interest. Recognition. Thinking everybody should be recognized the same way is a fatal flaw. We all want to be recognized in a very personalized way. Very important. So just 16 years later, Frederick Herzberg comes along and says, no, there's more to it. Well, let's ask some basic questions around the book. With all of that as a backdrop, do you think a miserable job is a bad job? Simple yes or no. I'll wait a second because I want to see the poll on this one. Is a miserable job a bad job? I see yes. Yes, it is. I see a no. This is good. Okay, we got one yes, one no. Chime in. Okay, there. Okay, Brian kind of explained it, so we'll go there. So we got a yes and no. That was good, and then we got kind of a in the middle. And the point is, according to Johnny, yes. Okay, I like this. Good. According to Johnny, yes. Well, really, if you think about it, a bad job depends on what? The individual. The individual decides. I might do the same job that Johnny does. And I may say, this is the greatest job I've ever had because it appeals to me personally. My value system, whatever the case may be, it appeals to me directly. Where Johnny says, that's a terrible job. That's a really bad job. So whether a job is good or bad is left up to the person, okay? That's really, really important. However, what Lencioni said is a miserable job has common characteristics, and that's why he wrote a book. He said, if you're experiencing misery in a job, you probably experience one or more of these Three Signs, back to his original title. We'll get to those in just a second. So how do you spot the signs? Well, let me tell you what it looked like for me at GM. I didn't know I was in a miserable job. I thought I had a good job. But had I been looking through the lens, the right lens, the lens that Patrick Lencioni offers in this book, and looked at it from a misery perspective, I would have realized I was absolutely miserable. Maybe it took me the 4 years that I had to take Xanax and a leave of absence to really get my attention. I wish somebody would have gave me the tools like this to really assess my job from a misery perspective. And here's what mine looked like. One of the greatest signs is called the Sunday blues. And on Sundays, we used to get this thing called the newspaper. It was delivered to our house. It sat on the driveway. It got wet when it rained. It was terrible. But I always looked forward to going and retrieving that newspaper, having my coffee before I went off to church. And that was my Sunday morning routine. The problem is I started to find myself drifting on Sunday morning into I only have 24 hours before I have to go back to that place and work. And that drifted into a Saturday afternoon game with one of my children, soccer game, usually where they chase the dandelions instead of the ball. They're so small. But I enjoyed seeing that. I found great joy in sitting out there in the sun and watching them, only to find myself starting to drift into, my goodness, Sunday's just around the corner, and that's only 24 hours. Are you getting the idea? And when that drifted into Friday night rides home from work, from the office, where I was praying, honestly, that the weekend would not go too quick, so I didn't have to get to Monday, I would have realized I was in a miserable job. And that's a good way to spot it. If you're experiencing that, be honest with yourself. It's a very good first indicator that you're in a miserable job. So real quick, what has the greatest impact on whether you're miserable in your job or not? Gallup did a poll, cross industry, over 10,000 participants, small and large companies, so very good mix, good sampling. And they asked this question, and it says what, not who, what has the greatest impact on whether you are miserable in your job? Anybody know? Take a wild guess. I'd love to see some of your guesses. It's not the pay. It is not the pay. Anybody? Your boss. It's not your boss, but it is your relationship with your boss. Isn't that interesting? Remember that communal piece we talked about in Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Remember that? The hardest thing to really focus on and one companies really don't focus on, that's changing. And I'm thankful. If you look at the generations that are entering the workforce now or have recently entered the workforce, they are demanding a trusting relationship with their supervisor. Like at no time in my history, 42-year career, that I've witnessed. I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful for that because it forces the most genuine, authentic version of ourselves to come out. And it enforces this idea of establishing really trusting relationships based on that, based on understanding each other, based on understanding what makes each other tick. You get the idea. So I'm thankful that that's happening. For many, many years, that did not happen. And I think that's a really, really positive step forward. Do you want to know how many people said a trusting relationship with their supervisor? 97. That's high. It's not the person. It's can I trust the person? It's not the pay. It's can I trust the person? Has my back, my best interest in mind. And are they acting that way? Okay. So let's get to the 3 signs. 3 signs of a miserable job. Anonymity. Irrelevance, we talked about that. Context creates relevance with story. And immeasurement, that's not a word. If you type it into Microsoft Word, it'll come up with this little red squiggly, and it says it's not in the dictionary. We'll just put it in the dictionary, and then it'll be okay. And because Lencioni says it's a word, okay? So immeasurement, go with me. So what is anonymity? I'm going to go through these definitions real quickly because they're not real sophisticated, but they require a little bit of commentary. So anonymity is simply this, okay? It is being unknown or invisible at work, or feeling as if you're unknown or invisible at work. Now, it doesn't mean that you're not in a position where you have a lot of visibility or anything like that. It means you're not able to express your genuine voice, your genuine expression of who you are in the work in the workplace, okay? And so it's hard to care for others and be cared for when that happens. I played a dangerous game most of my career of compartmentalization. I tried to be what I thought others wanted me to be as a father, as a pastor, as an employee, as a boss. And the problem was I lost a sense of who I was. And this internal conflict starts to take in. If you're doing that, I highly encourage you to take an inventory. And if you're compartmentalizing, I would encourage you to think about how you can mitigate that or eliminate it altogether and just get comfortable, esteem, confidence, get comfortable with who you are. Let that esteem lead you to self-actualization. When you believe you have a voice, your voice matters, you're known because of your voice, and it represents the genuine version, not the one that tells them what they want to hear, but the one that really expresses your genuine and authentic version. That motivates and it creates self-worth. Remember Frederick Herzberg, okay? I did not have that at GM. I expressed what I thought they wanted to hear. I spoke into things the way I thought they wanted to hear them. Okay. That was dangerous because I lost a sense of who I was. Irrelevance is super important. Okay. This is the idea that I don't really know about the work that I'm doing and the impact it really has. And people have a fundamental need to know what they do counts and matters. They do. They really do. And I'm finding this even in my career today. And this has followed me my entire career. My responsibility as a leader and their responsibility as a team member is to constantly commit to connecting dots. If you don't know as an individual performer what kind of impact you're having, sit down and in earnest, with intentionality, with your supervisor, with other team members, colleagues, seek to connect those dots. And if you can't make them connect, don't lie about it. I'll give you a great example. I had a nurse working for me about 10, 15 years ago. She joined a learning organization because her thought was she could affect more nurses, which she loved nursing, by the way, this way by teaching our 90,000 nurses how to do their job and really affect better patient outcomes as a result, which was her real desire if she was putting together the curriculum for them to consume on a regular basis. About a year into her job, I realized in a one-on-one and asked her, you don't seem real happy. And she said, I just miss being that close to the bedside. And even though I can connect the dots that get me to the bedside, there's too many of them to connect. And what's more important to me is I have less dots to connect to get to the bedside. So we got her a job out in Denver, Colorado, I think is where she's still at. And she's a nurse there and she's thriving. Help people to connect dots. Don't lie about them. Don't try to manipulate. You remember manipulate, but help them to see if that level of relevance really resonates with them. That'll create a greater sense of purpose and motivation for them, whether they stay or they go to Denver, Colorado. And the last one is a measurement. And this is an easy one. You got to measure because if people cannot really determine if they're making progress or not, it's like beating your proverbial head against the wall. It just, you wonder each day, am I making a difference at all? So you got to have ways to be able to measure progress. I would encourage you to do this. Focus on lead measures. There's two kind of measures you can focus on. Lag measures are based on things that have already happened to you. We're intoxicated with that. Well, last month we did pretty good. We produced this many units. We fell short this much. We did, you name it. Well, that's very disempowering because at the end of the day, there's not much we can do about it. But getting people to define, my organization actually defines their own lead measures, things they want to focus on, that they understand from the past can have a great impact on the future is super empowering. And so a good example of that might be, we've learned that if we do this particular behavior in the past, it seems to have a very positive effect. So let's focus on that behavior as a goal on 90% of the work we do. And we can, with a high degree of confidence, feel if we hit that goal, that we'll have a very good outcome. Very big difference than waiting on the results and hoping and praying that they come out right. Involve people in those lead measures, not the lag measures. And just keep their scorecard. If you're a leader, or you end up becoming a leader, don't come up with your own fancy scorecards. Let them define it. You know, it's interesting what happens when you start to keep score, and it's even more interesting what happens when they determine what the important things are to keep score about. That's really powerful. Okay? And that just allows progress to be made in an organization. So I love this last quote, and I'll leave this with you. The more I want to get something done, the less I call it work. This guy named Richard Bach, he actually wrote a book called Jonathan Livingston Seagull. It's set back in the 60s. Who knows what was going on, but it's a wild book. It's just weird. There's no other way to characterize it. But it's weirdly engaging because I read it, and not many people have. Not many people know Richard Bach. But essentially, it said this. It said, there's a seagull that's amongst his seagull friends on the beach. And the seagull's wondering, why do we only fly? We're given these wings, but we only fly when we need food or we fear something. So kind of a flight mentality when we fear something. Why is it? We have these wings, we could be doing so much more. And he socializes all the time with these seagull friends, but none of them buy into it. They're like, no, we don't need to do it. Just when we eat and just when we fear something, we can get away. So one day he decides to take off and experience it himself. And the whole point is he comes back to share with his friends that this isn't work at all. It gave me a whole new perspective. I was highly aspirational at the prospect of flying, and I knew I had the capability. Does that sound familiar to you? And so I self-actualized, and I gained a whole new perspective that none of you have, but I desire for all of you to share. And I don't call that work at all. That's something I want to do. You see, it was left to that individual seagull to decide in an individualized, personalized way what made him happy, what he enjoyed, how he gained inner peace, all the way back to the beginning. And I encourage you to look at your careers through the lens of job misery. You can fool yourself for a long time and collect a paycheck for a long time. Believe me, I did that. You can avoid having to take this really hard look on a regular basis on whether you're really self-actualizing in your role, or you can be very deliberate and intentional and really make course corrections on a very frequent basis to be able to be everything you desire to be and everything you're capable of becoming. I hope that for each one of you, wherever you are in your careers, I hope you'll take this little roadmap. I hope you'll look at things, these three signs: anonymity, relevance, and measurement or immeasurement. And I hope you'll kind of look at it through that lens to make sure that what you're doing, while it can't be idyllic and it can't be utopia, it's fulfilling. And I think Brian said it really well. It fulfills your calling and your passion. And those are heart conditions that need to connect here, certainly, but definitely need to start here where conviction begins. So I hope you enjoyed that. That was a little excerpt from the 3 Signs of a Miserable Job. That's all I have. There's a family. I need to get them off of there. I don't know if I have their permission to share or not. But anyways, there you go. Let's open it up for questions if we can for 10 minutes. I'd love to just chat with you. Anything goes. It could be about my story, could be the context I shared, it could be about the book, could be a little bit of both. And you got to come up at least with a couple questions. That'll make me feel, that'll help me self-actualize as it relates to this.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, okay, I was about to say the same thing Brian just put in the chat window. Advice for when you find yourself in a miserable job. So if you feel that some of those 3 qualities or all of them apply to you, what to do. I mean, what's your
Yeah. Yeah. You know, he would say, let me tell you what the book says and then what I would say. Is that fair? Can I do both of those? Okay. So the book would say you really want to buy a voodoo doll. Yes, that could work too, by the way. The book would say that you should notice those signs and the degree to which you're experiencing misery. And that's determined 2 ways: the depth in each one of them and the breadth. So if I'm feeling irrelevant, anonymous, and not able to measure, you're in a pretty bad place. Don't let it get there. And that would be Lencioni's advice. So consistently interrogate those three things so that you can kind of address them as they present themselves. I would say, as you do that, build that into your regular review process with whoever it is you're meeting with. I do that. Like, I'll talk to my boss about the importance of my joy, my happiness, my inner peace. That's not really her responsibility, except to understand it and understand where they're not matching. And I hope she never fools me, is a good enough salesperson to fool me into believing that she can satisfy that, because she can't. But I have to be really honest. And that creates vulnerability. I've been in a couple jobs where I said, this is just not what I'm desirous and capable of. And by the way, I don't feel like I have much of a voice. And I don't, and there can be promises like, I'll let you speak up more in meetings. That's not what we're talking about. It's talking about valuing that voice. It's talking about a much deeper meaning. It's okay to say, I think I need to find another seat on the bus. It's okay. For the leader needs to commit to that same thing. So we encourage in our organization, at least, that leaders first take this and then they do it with their teams, and then they create this interaction. And many of them build it into their performance review cycle, and that works out really well. It's a hard place to find yourself, but it's even harder when you don't realize it until it hits you right in the face. And that's what happened to me, to be honest with you. I got a wake-up call.
Yeah, it can be a scary conversation for people to have with their boss, worrying that, that could be the end.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I give that nurse a lot of credit. I'll never forget that. And I've had more of those conversations than I can even do on this call. But when we sat in a one-on-one and I asked her, how are you doing? Was this a good move for you? And she said, it's too disconnected. It's not relevant enough for me. She basically signaled to me, and you can't do anything about that because this is what this job requires. It's just the wrong job. And we worked together on a very gracious exit. It wasn't she was a bad person. She was in the wrong seat. My job is to find something of more purpose for her. Her job is to express it. And it's hard when somebody doesn't express it. So, yeah, as hard as it is, trust me, it's a lot harder to go 20, 30 years into it and then have to deal with it. And that can be really to your health and to your marriage. In my case, both things suffered.
Yeah, if you don't communicate it, things can go sideways in many ways, like you said.
Yeah, my wife and I have this agreement with each other. If you've ever heard this term, the lack of mutually shared expectation results in a premeditated frustration. That's a really important thing. It's been important in our marriage. We struggled. We've had our little ups and downs like every relationship does, but our biggest struggles, those valleys, those deep valleys, have been when we haven't expressed our expectations. So we're setting ourselves up for frustration. Why do that? If you have a chance to at least express yourself and your expectation, what's the worst thing that can happen? The person may not meet it, but at least it was expressed. All right. What else? Good question. Tough one. Tough one. Just make sure you test miserable job. This is one of those labels I don't like. People go, oh, I'm just not happy. I'm just not, this just isn't. I know, but step back for a second and ask yourself why. Because this can be about you. I mean, you might have some things you have to work through yourself. Maybe it doesn't have to do with the fact you don't have a voice and you're not measuring things for progress and knowing that you're making some progress. And it might not be that, it may be you have to work on some things yourself. All right.
I just wanted to say that I had the pleasure of knowing Bill and being able to talk to him in a mentoring role when I found myself in a miserable job. And it was very scary because I'd been there for 20 years and scared to get back out there when I lose my value in the workplace and those relationships that I had learned and starting new. And I wanted to say one thing to anyone that I would have a conversation with, and that's don't be afraid of that. You have that value from the skill sets and things that you've learned, and starting new has been fantastic for me. So this is good. Have a mentor, be able to talk to people like Bill that have done this and been down this path before. Dave Ramsey and Ken Coleman have a great Get Clear assessment that I believe is free, or maybe $10 or something, that really talks about your purpose and passion and will point you to where you might can find what you would enjoy doing, because you've spent 20 years there, but you don't want to spend 20 more if you're unhappy. So this has been great. I'll quit talking and just want to say thanks a lot, Bill. I always appreciate you.
Yeah, Brian, it's good to hear your voice. I saw you were on that. That's good. You know, Brian is an example I use often, quite frankly. I de-identify, but I'll never forget how bold he was to come forward at that point in his career and express where he was. And the boldness comes out of the willingness to step forward and address it. And man, that is hard. That's courage. That's courage. So I applaud you, Brian. It takes courage. Hey, take control of your career. It's yours, you know? Don't let it take control of you. I did. It wasn't a very good result.
All right. Well, Bill, thank you so much for today. This was great. Lots of good
You're great.
information and good to see you again.
Good to see you as well, Jennifer. Thanks for having me, and for all those on the phone. You know, I hope you'll take this to heart wherever you are in your career. But thank you for weighing in, Marcus. I love your quote. I'd love to steal that or leverage it. Not steal. It's bad. Leverage your quote if I could. It was a great quote, and I appreciate that. It was a good insight. But thanks to all. Appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you very much. This was the last webinar in our series for this season, and we will start back with a new series beginning in September. But all of the past ones are all available on our YouTube channel as well. All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And thanks everybody for coming.
Thanks, Jennifer.